on equal opportunity. We are so fortunate to have amazing speakers today who I will just introduce briefly, and I will ask them to share more about their background in answer to their first questions. We are joined today by Wilneida Negrón, Director of Policy and Research at coworker.org, Eric Reicin, President and CEO of BBB National Programs, ReNika Moore, Director of Racial Justice Program at ACLU, Peter Romer-Freidman, Principal at Gupta, Wessler, PLLC. So let's just jump right into our discussion. And I will ask you our first question as we delve into these AI and other algorithmic systems today. And I will start with Wilneida. You recently published a report entitled LittleTech is Coming for Workers, which explores labor-related technologies that workers must interact with in the labor market. What is LittleTech, and can you describe for us the types of technologies that are used to advertise jobs, recruit and screen job seekers, and interview potential candidates?
Yes, thank you, Director Yang, for that introduction. And really through the work that we do at Coworker, we really began talking with workers about the different tools and websites and apps that they were interacting with and encountering both at work and when they were navigating the job markets. And very quickly, we had a very humble list of about 10 to 15 different vendors and became really curious, particularly because during COVID, there was an increasing reliance on technology and digital solutions to facilitate work. And at the same time, there was a really historical amount of venture capital that went into the tech industry, which was creating a lot of new and exciting companies and a lot of new products for employers to sort of shop around and learn about. And so what started with 10 to 15 vendors that we had heard from workers, again, that they were encountering at work, really led to over 650 different products that touch on different parts of the labor process. About 100 of those 650 that we identified and created a database for are specifically products and vendors that assist employers with sourcing, hiring, background screening, onboarding of workers. So in other words, we encountered a lot of technology products, and we decided to sort of call that LittleTech to sort of define what seemed like a marketplace that is very different from sort of the bigger technology companies that we talk about in our current news, to really the hundreds of some still big companies, but other smaller vendors that are really introducing a lot of both exciting and products that we don't really know too much about of what their impact and their risk are for workers. And so with that, we called it LittleTech to sort of just conceptualize just the number of products in what seemed like an unregulated marketplace of options that an employer has to sort of discover and find different technology solutions to help with different human resource functions. And what we found when we zeroed in on like the 100 of those 650 or so vendors and products that we identified was we found a lot of those 100 products, again, that help facilitate sourcing and hiring and background screening. We found that a lot of them were very sophisticated. A lot of what was mentioned in the introduction. They were collecting in the sort of the pre-screening process, the screening out or the screening in of potential candidates. We're collecting a lot of different types of new data, everything from workers' emotions, behaviors and actions. And we're collecting a lot of that information to then make predictions about job performance or cultural fit. And we saw this through products that do this collecting of workers' emotions through video screening, which we see in a lot of products that tailored to white-collar industries. And we also saw this in products that are more for mass-based recruitment sectors like retail or hospitality. But what we saw differently was a variety of different online pre-employment personality quizzes and assessments that workers now had to sort of jump the hoop through to get through, along with sort of completing their resume and their, submitting an online application. There were just a variety of different quizzes. We also saw with automated sourcing and recruitment platforms, we saw that a lot of them were gathering publicly available data, and that can be from innocent sources, like most of us may have a LinkedIn profile, to things about you that may be in the search engine results or your social media sites. All of that information is considered public data, and these companies are creating very sophisticated sourcing platforms that use machine learning to gather that data on potential candidates, to recognize patterns, and again, to make the predictions about a worker's competency, their behavior, their retention, their engagement, and really whatever outcome an employer may be interested in. So the collecting of what seems just information that may be about you online to then predict your ability to succeed in that job is getting increasingly sophisticated. And lastly, we saw again for hiring platforms that are to help employers in their retail and hospitality where there might be a lot of turnover. We saw, rightfully so, that to help employers navigate the hundreds and thousands of applications, that there were workers were now intersecting with conversational chatbots. And these chatbots are, really their purpose was to facilitate the application process, but also some of them ask questions that are assessing and screening potential candidates. And so if you can't access or can't use a chatbot very well, that could automatically disqualify you. So just a lot more technological barriers and technological products and tools that workers have to navigate in what traditionally was, you upload your resume, or you would, upload a PDF or fill out an online application.
Thank you for that context. That is so helpful because it makes clear what a rapidly changing kind of landscape we're looking at. And given that, I want to turn now to Eric Reicin, who's the president and CEO of BBB National Programs. Your organization, Eric, includes so many companies, industry experts, trade associations who've been working together to examine these new uses of automated technologies in employment. So I'd love to hear from you, how prevalent are AI algorithmic decision-making tools in recruiting and screening job applicants today, and why might an employer use these different types of technologies?
Well, sure, Chair Burrows, and I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Chair Burrows and Director Yang. I am Eric Reicin, CEO of BBB National Programs, and before I took this role in 2019, I practiced law for the past 25 years. BBB National Programs is a nonprofit organization where businesses go to enhance consumer trust and where consumers are heard. And BBB National Programs has been developing, delivering, and operating independent industry self-regulatory and accountability programs through BBB National Programs or its predecessor since 1971. Our Center for Industry Self-Regulation, which is our 501c3, has two independent industry self-regulatory incubators running and a couple on the way. The one that's most relevant for here today, this roundtable, is one on artificial intelligence in hiring and recruiting, where we're working with 18 major corporations and noted law firm Epstein, Becker, and Green. And in this incubator, we are developing principles for trustworthy AI in hiring and recruiting. We're also thinking about whether or not an independent vendor certification or some sort of dispute resolution mechanism for employers, B2B, not B2E. But right now we are focused on AI principles and have just begun sketching out what an independent certification mechanism might look like. But in answer to your specific question, how prevalent and why, to follow on our last panelist who was very thoughtful, nearly all Fortune 500 companies use online algorithmic recruitment, sourcing, and hiring tools. The video interview technology that was described a little bit earlier, there was a survey before COVID that said about 60% of companies were using it. A 2020 Gartner HR survey reported that 86% of large organizations were turning to the virtual interview technology. An immersive study the same year said 55% of all HR managers in the United States use predictive algorithms hiring. I personally think that really underestimates it. I think the numbers are quite higher. I think many employers are not even realize that they're using it. If you use LinkedIn, Monster, Indeed, or any of the larger staffing firms in your recruitment or sourcing activities, then you're using it. So when we think of AI, I think a little bit broader. I think about record keeping, sourcing, screening, onboarding, performance management, talent management, DEIA, DEIB activities, which can range from the least automated, which provides for the most human intervention, to the most automated. We are going to talk about later, I hope, a little bit about applicant tracking systems, which run the gamut from simple record keeping to quite sophisticated algorithms. Obviously, as part of those, there's machine learning algorithms that are trained to select resumes and deploy them to ranked hundreds, thousands, or frankly, millions. The video screening systems that were mentioned earlier could also increase the number of video interviews considered. Instead of the first 20 or the first 50 applicants, it could be 1,000 interviews. But in the more sophisticated systems where employers need to be very careful are those automated assessments that are based on lingual analysis, meaning they transcribe and analyze the context of candidates' recorded responses to pre-selected questions, and then look at tone, word choice, and body language, sort of what we're doing right here today. There also are testing and gaming systems, which weren't discussed earlier, that really use supervised machine learning to use data collected from a candidate to infer who might perform in a particular job. The larger staffing firms have incredible databases on folks in terms of what they've done in the past, and those are just a few to come to mind. But as to why are companies using this? I think there are different use cases for large corporations versus small, medium-sized organizations. I think there are different use cases for staffing firms that need to place a candidate within one day versus corporations which may take a week or 2 weeks or a month or 2 months to source a candidate. And I also think we need to think about sourcing, which is candidate discovery and inviting folks into the process, expanding the opportunities, expanding the pool using tools versus the actual selection process. And again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the sheer number of applications and the hiring speed in a low unemployment environment are things that are very important. There are a number of pitfalls to watch out for, which I imagine we'll have a chance to discuss more later. But if used correctly, in my opinion, AI and machine learning technology allows organizations to harness the power of data, efficiently make sound decisions, reduce sourcing recruiting time in the current low unemployment environment, use the same selection procedure or interview questions for each candidate, which thereby reduces implicit bias that exists in subjective decision-making, and I hope expands the pool for diversity, equity, inclusion activities. I do believe that employers overwhelmingly want to comply with the law, and employment lawyers in our incubator are thoughtfully working on this topic. But employers should recognize, regardless of where you sit on this call, employers are on the hook, whether or not they use a vendor or not, and they need to ensure that non-discrimination takes place under relevant law.
Thanks so much, Eric, for your work and the leadership of those in your working group. I know from hearing more about this, I think it really will take us all. These are complicated issues, and we really appreciate the insights that you can share. My next question is for ReNika. Your organization has been advocating for policies that bridge the digital divide and promote equity in digital access and software design. Worker advocates raise these issues at our kickoff hire roundtable as well, that technology can exclude communities from jobs. Wilneida also raised the new hurdles that chatbots and technology can raise for workers in a way that may not be job related. They may not need to navigate these systems to actually perform successfully on the job. Tell us more about what the digital divide looks like and how it can be a barrier to good jobs for underrepresented populations.
Sure, and thank you for having me. So again, my name is ReNika Moore. I'm the director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU. And so what we've been doing at the ACLU, working with organizations like Wilneida's and Coworker, is both talking to workers and talking to communities that represent marginalized and previously underrepresented communities. So we're thinking about, because of race, because of gender, LGBTQ status, disability. These are some of the categories, national origin, language minorities. These are characteristics that are both protected by law and also historically have faced real barriers that have nothing to do with qualifications for a job in accessing good jobs and accessing employment opportunities. And that's often most difficult to detect in the hiring space and in the recruiting realm. And that has been true historically. And I think that's why this conversation is so important. And so I want to talk about the digital divide and just some of the background that can affect ways in which these technologies don't reach their potential in opening doors and allowing people who have historically been excluded into the marketplace, into the labor market. So when we think about both access to the hardware, the technology, as well as access to the internet and broadband access, high-speed broadband access, we see digital divide. So that's the digital divide that we historically think about when we hear that term. We know that Black and Hispanic people are more likely to rely, for example, on smartphones only. So they don't have desktops that can affect the use and the interface, which we'll talk about more later. We also know that about 15% of American households on average do not have broadband access. At the same time, that number is more than double, for example, for Black households, in which 34% of Black households don't have access to high-speed, reliable internet. And we know that we also see lower rates of internet use for people living with disabilities, where they report about 20% lower internet use rates than people without disabilities. And that cost is the primary factor for why their internet use is not as high as they might otherwise want it to be. We also see the digital divide mirrors that when we're talking about this space and we're talking about these technologies, that the digital divide mirrors the real world divide for people from historically marginalized communities. And so that's when we think about both how these technologies are deployed, but also how they're trained, and thinking about the training data. A lot of these technologies are using, which Wilneida referred to, databases that are available publicly. And so the dangers of data-driven technologies, I call it the over, under, and invisible problem. So we see overrepresented, often communities from marginalized identities. So they're overrepresented in negative and low quality data sets. And that would include records from the criminal legal system. So arrest records, conviction records, they're often difficult to read. They're not uniform. They're often involve misspellings of names or variations of names, and eviction records. So these are the types of records where we know, for example, Black and Hispanic communities are more likely to be overrepresented in, and yet they provide generally unreliable but negative information about an individual and about a group. At the same time, we know that marginalized groups are underrepresented in more positive or neutral and high quality data sets. So that might be data sets that an employer has of who successful hires have been in terms of performance, in terms of tenure and how long they were retained by the company due to historic employment discrimination. For example, data sets like FICO high credit scores or homeowner databases. And these are databases that are often used and pulled to determine who should see advertisements, who should see and know about employment opportunities. And at the same time, we know that marginalized groups are also invisible in the data. And that's due to a variety of different factors. One is the digital divide that I talked about. But we also know, for example, that LGBTQ people, especially when we think about trans people, often lack accurate and consistent government ID. And so how they're represented in the data may vary. We know that people living with disabilities are more likely to have interruptions and gaps in their education and in their employment, such that they aren't showing up in the data in the same way. And so these can create real problems in terms of what the understanding of the AI as it's being trained of what the world looks like and who communities are that need to be considered. And so when we think about it, as we go into further into the conversation, keeping in mind that these are some of the barriers that communities with marginalized identities face when we're trying to utilize these technologies, and that we have to be mindful of in order to ensure that we are giving all workers and all people who want to work equal opportunity to good jobs, to high quality jobs, and being able to work safely in livable wage.
Thank you. That is a really excellent synopsis of one of the, some of the issues we're up against. I want to turn now to Peter Romer-Freidman, who is a litigator and principal at Gupta, Wessler, PLLC. So you've represented workers in cases where the employers shared the job announcement with specific types of potential applicants, also known as sourcing. And how has AI changed the way that people see job ads, apply for jobs, and participate in job interviews, sort of picking up on that theme that Ms. Moore raised at the very end of her comments?
Thanks, Chair Burrows, and thanks everyone else for participating today. Job advertising has undergone an enormous shift due to digital technology. By far, the biggest change is that in most digital spaces, every person is shown a different set of ads. No one sees the same set anytime. This often results in historically disadvantaged groups being denied information about jobs, and it can reinforce racial or gender segregation in certain industries or certain types of jobs. So let's take two different people. One worker might be older and male, or younger and male. He's looking for a job in the same labor market as an older woman. The first might receive that employer's job ad when they're surfing the web or scrolling their social media feed. The worker might click on the ad, learn more about the job, apply for that job, and even get hired, while the second worker never sees the ad, never learns about the job, doesn't apply, even though she visited the same websites and used the same social media app as the first worker. The same is true of the job search apps that Eric just mentioned earlier. Two people may be searching in something like ZipRecruiter or LinkedIn and not see the same set of ads displayed or the same set of jobs shown to them. This was not really a problem back in the 1960s when Congress enacted Title VII or the ADEA. Back then, employers primarily used newspapers, radio, even billboards to advertise, but everyone could see those ads and decide whether they wanted to apply. It wasn't a unique set for everybody. In some cases, employers that were biased would only place their job ads in certain publications in mostly white that mostly white people would read or listen to. And the government considered that to be illegal back then. But still, even in that situation, a Black worker could still buy the paper, could listen to the radio. Everyone had access to it. Digital technology has changed that. In the past decade, we've found that major technology companies made it possible for employers to only show their job ads to workers of particular protected statuses based on race, gender, age. They made it possible as well to target ads to people based on their interest in things that could be proxies for protected classes or very local geography so that you would only have particular racial groups shown ads. This was feasible because tech companies like Facebook and others required their users to disclose their demographic information, and those companies monitor everything that we do online and we interact with. Those companies then require advertisers to choose which people they want to send their ads based on demographics, or in some cases, proxies for those demographics. My clients and I worked as well with ReNika's organization, the ACLU, and the Communications Workers of America to investigate whether employers were actually doing this. It turns out a lot were. Employers jumped at the opportunity to engage in this kind of digital discrimination. In 2017, we found that about a third of all job ads that were being sent on Facebook to people were restricted in terms of who would get them based on either age or gender or both. And in 2017 and 18, CWA, the ACLU, my former colleagues at Ouden and Golden and I, we filed charges with the EEOC. The EEOC found that this very practice violates Title VII and the ADEA. That is, to limit who can see a job ad based on a person's age is a discriminatory publication in violation of our federal civil rights laws. The Department of Justice and HUD have both concluded that the same kind of practice in the housing context violates the Fair Housing Act. Now, in 2019, my clients and I won a settlement in which Facebook agreed to prohibit employers from expressly targeting job, housing, and credit ads to users based on protected statuses like race, age, gender, or from using very local geographic targeting of ads. And those are really good developments. And other platforms have followed suit, like Twitter and Google have followed those similar reforms. Those reforms are really important, but there are still some problems when it comes to advertising. Even when employers don't want to discriminate and they want everyone to receive their ads on an equal basis, it turns out that the platforms themselves are applying algorithms to decide who should actually receive the ads. So if I choose to send an ad to 10,000 people, but the set of people who could get the ad are 100,000 people, the platform has to make a choice. And they often are using explicit characteristics that are unlawful, like age, gender, race, or proxies for them to decide who gets these ads. And so there continues to be persistent discrimination on all of the platforms, we believe, that are delivering job ads. When it comes to actually being hired and applying for jobs, I want to note, as a couple of the panelists have said before, the biggest change is that we're seeing so many more applications. When most of us on this panel were applying for jobs out of college, there might be a small number of people applying for jobs, but now you see hundreds, if not thousands. A Glassdoor study found that there were 250 applications for every corporate job. And so one thing that I'm interested in is actually the impact that not just AI has, but on what employers do because of the big volume of applications. So first off, employers are not really looking at resumes for very long. The average resume is looked at for 7.4 seconds, according to one study. And there are a lot of major employers that don't look at an application for even a single second. And so what happens when that occurs? So sometimes employers will adopt basic rules, not even very complex algorithmic rules, to screen people out. For example, an employer might automatically screen out any applicant who had not graduated within the last 2 years, which would have an obvious disparate impact based on age. A lot of employers respond to the volume of applications by simply relying heavily on referrals for hiring. And so, that can be an enormous problem when you have a workforce that is not particularly diverse and you have mostly white and or male employees referring their friends or family. People's networks tend to be segregated. And this is one of the issues that we've pointed out in our case, our pattern or practice case against Facebook for their own hiring and discrimination against Black workers. If you only have 4% of your workforce that is Black and you're relying heavily on referrals, and those people and the company is hiring folks who are referred at a much higher rate than people who are not referred by current employees, it's going to have an enormous disparate impact, and it may not be justified by business necessity because there are other ways to hire in a non-discriminatory way. So I think it's imperative that we not just think about where is there bias in a more complex algorithmic decision-making model, but where are there actually rules and human policies that are being deployed in a more traditional way because of the large volume of applications.
Thanks so much, Peter. I wanted to turn now to Wilneida to dig more into those issues and to look at some of the specific barriers on how technology used to source potential candidates or advertise jobs to potential job seekers can lead to discrimination, particularly for people with disabilities.
Thank you. And I really appreciate what it's been said already by the speakers. And I think what we've heard, just to summarize, is just a variety of risks that include everything from disparate impact to disability discrimination to privacy issues to facilitating implicit or explicit biases or preferences that employers might have. I think what we heard was really the potential for a selection bias exists in two different ways. It exists in ways, number one, that employers now have tools available that can, and as it was noted, bigger technology companies that collect demographic data where they can optimize for specific attributes that they are looking for. And then the second way selection bias can come up is in the predictive models themselves and the intelligent systems, and sort of what ReNika talked about, the data that trains those intelligent systems could be trained in a way that don't optimize to identify human potential and creativity, and they're optimized to perpetuate sort of pre-existing inequalities that exist in the labor market. And we have a few high-profile examples of larger companies where that were using automated hiring tools, and it was found that there was there was a bias and a downgrade of Black and women candidates. So we have already some really high-profile learning lessons of where companies that have found that those tools were downgrading Black or women candidates and retreated from using these tools. And so looking at disabled workers specifically, we have found that a lot of what I mentioned earlier, a lot of the online tests and personality quizzes are not suitable or really require further due diligence for how they are received or their usability for candidates that may have everything from ADHD to dyslexia and color blindness. Because some of these online tools are also measuring attention span, these are things that can be a challenge for some candidates and can automatically downgrade their application. And so, yeah, these tools will help to screen out, but the way that they're designed, they're not designed in an equitable way to sort of minimize the automatic downgrade that certain candidates would get if they have particular disabilities. And in addition, and this has come up in research already, but video interviews also, as a candidate who's speaking and articulating and maybe not has particular speech impediments or has different behaviors in how they are talking in a video, those could be analyzed by some of these platforms and downgrade their application just based on sort of, again, disabilities that they may have that are automatically screened by these programs and seen as not favorable. In terms of the automated hiring tools, they can also filter out disabled candidates. And it was mentioned earlier, if they are designed in a way that don't give liberty for people to have gaps in their resumes for everything from illnesses to disability. And as ReNika mentioned, people that have medical conditions, so sometimes they do have gaps in their resumes. And so some of these tools will automatically pick up on that. And if you are not accounting for that, you are going to be losing a lot of high quality candidates that happen to have a disability, but were screened out because they maybe had different gaps in their resume. As it was mentioned, by law, employers can't inquire about physical disabilities, mental health, age, gender, and marital status, but some of the automated tools that screen that collect some of the publicly available data can also pick up private information from public sources without a worker's consent. And so that goes into more sort of privacy harm issues. Lastly, we also are finding that a lot of the web and text-based conversational chatbots that are really the middle person that is screening the hundreds of applications and interacting with workers, like a lot of these chatbots, conversational chatbots, make it really hard for workers, particularly disabled workers, to request reasonable accommodations as well. And so there's, building up on what everyone mentioned, there is a lot of evidence that we are gathering, that we are learning from, that really calls for the need to understand how these tools, buying off the shelf is probably not the best thing. We need to understand exactly how they work and account for the ways that they may be downgrading and screening out potential high quality candidates.
Thank you so much, Wilneida, for sharing that perspective of challenges facing workers. And let's dig into that further, ReNika. How can the use of automated technologies to recruit or screen applicants impact people of color and Native Americans? And also, what types of jobs are most impacted by the use of these technologies in hiring and recruiting?
Sure. So there are a couple of technologies that we have real concerns about, particularly for people of color, and because many people hold multiple identities. So you may be Black and also live with a disability. I'll be talking to some extent too about intersectional protected characteristics as well. But so some of the predictive tools, and this builds on the comments you've heard from the other speakers, but the tools that, and we're specifically locking in on these predictive tools. We're talking about these are the tools that are trying to guess or predict who will make the best hire, who should be properly recruited, or who's most likely to apply for the jobs in the recruiting context. And so there are, I'll be talking about assessments, video interview analysis, voice recognition technology, and then facial recognition technology. These are four areas where we know that in terms of the training data, in terms of the ways that it might be deployed, that these have a high risk of having a disparate impact on racial minorities and on people potentially who live with disabilities, which may include people who are a racial minority and live with a disability. So I'll start with talking about kind of the video interview analysis and the voice recognition technology. So we know that based on studies in terms of voice recognition technology, there have been studies done of sort of the large company, big company voice recognition technology, where what we see is that Black voices were more likely to be misunderstood in terms of the instructions that they were giving to kind of mainstream voice instructions that we might use on our smartphone or we might use in our homes. And so what we saw is that about 19% of the time, white people's instructions were incorrectly understood, whereas for Black people, that number rose to 35%. So we saw that, and then we've also seen that in terms of unreadable and unrecognizable words, where the system didn't understand what the speaker was saying, that Black people were 20% more likely to not be understood by these systems. And so that's a real problem in terms of voice recognition technology. And we also see that with people who don't speak English as a primary language, that often in terms of the training data and in terms of how these technologies work, we see much higher rates of mistakes in understanding what people are saying, or simply not understanding at all and not reading at all in terms of responses that might be given and analyzed by technology in terms of video interview analysis and voice recognition technology. We also know that for facial recognition technology, that we've seen there's been work done by Dr. Joy Buolamwini, who has looked at and studied through her gender shade study, looking at the mistaken identification rates that were higher for people with darker skin and more likely for women. So darker skinned women were much more likely to be misidentified by facial recognition technology. And we've seen that that can be problematic in terms of how it's being used, and particularly where it's being used. We've also seen problems where it's been trained and normed to a white middle-class standard in terms of looking at and reviewing emotions and understanding tone that can create real problems. And then when we talk about personality assessments and gamified assessments, that similarly, they're often building off of prior workforce. And because, as we've talked about before, there's been historical discrimination in our workforce in employment in terms of hiring, but also in terms of performance evaluations in the workforce. There's data that show that that Black and other employees of color are more likely to be rated lower for similar performance. And so then what that means about who's whose performance is evaluated and used to identify exceptional employees or good employees can create real problems for the training data and thinking about and using personality assessments and gamified assessments. So those are the technologies that we have real concerns about, and they raise real red flags in terms of potential, and that employers should be very cautious about the technologies they're using and ensure that they're not relying on these types of technologies in ways that don't have guardrails. And that, I think what we're seeing from workers and other organizations is that we're looking very closely at these and starting to understand them more and really identify and ferret out where discrimination is happening.
Very helpful. I want to go back to Peter Romer-Freidman for a minute and talk a little bit about the workers that you represented who alleged that Facebook had discriminated against them in recruiting based on age and gender. Can you tell us about their experience and what can discrimination, or how can discrimination operate really through automated job ads and recruiting tools?
Thanks. So happy to talk about my clients. They're wonderful people. So back in 2017, when we first started to investigate this problem of demographic discrimination, digital discrimination in advertising of jobs, we contacted a few workers who were members of the Communication Workers of America. They ranged in ages from 47 to 69. The three that we ended up filing charges with were all African American and had worked in the telecommunications industry. One was a technician, cable technician, and two were in customer service, so kind of different ranges of jobs. Two of them were in Ohio, one was in Maryland. All three were searching for jobs, and they were having not a lot of luck. They all looked in affirmative ways, job boards, the kind of things that everyone does. But they were also interested in learning about opportunities via more passive ways, like advertising on social media, Google display ads. They noticed, though, that they were not seeing pretty much any job ads. The only of the three workers, Laura, Linda, and Maurice, Linda was the only one who could recall receiving a job ad. The one time she got that ad, she actually did follow up and learn more about the position. I don't believe she ended up applying, but it certainly was a good way for her to kind of get her attention and apply. At this time, Linda was actually living with her adult daughter, who was also looking for a job. Her daughter was getting ads all the time on Facebook. And Linda was wondering, why am I not seeing these ads that my daughter is seeing? It turns out when she got in touch with the union, we've been investigating this problem with, that we knew exactly why she wasn't getting these ads. Hundreds of companies we found were not sending ads to older people, and in some cases even to women, and they were only targeting their ads to young people, in some cases under 40 or even younger. And a lot of these were in pretty much any industry you can think of, big company, medium-sized company, small company, they were all doing it. Linda, the others were shocked and disappointed. As Black people in America, they're especially as Black women, for Laura and Linda, they're used to rampant discrimination, but seeing it so explicitly here, where companies intentionally decided not to send their job ads to people based on their age or their gender, was pretty shocking. At the same time, my clients, they were offended, but they wanted to stop this practice. And so, like a lot of folks who have courage to do the right thing, they filed charges with the EEOC. They spoke out about this publicly, and they talked to other workers about their experiences. And because of their courage to stand up to these practices, they were able to make changes, not just in how Facebook allows advertising, but most major platforms now don't allow the kind of explicit targeting that occurs. That said, as I mentioned earlier, we still have this problem of this systemic problem of algorithmic discrimination. And so, when it comes time now for the platforms to deliver the ads, there have been some pretty shocking results in terms of measuring the kind of automated algorithmic discrimination that occurs. when Facebook and other companies send their ads to people. So a group called Upturn, for example, worked with academic researchers to do a study to see how if they published ads to the same group of people with different content and different language and images, would there be different results in terms of who received those ads? And the results are pretty shocking. An ad for a job in the lumber industry was sent by Facebook to an audience that was 72% white and 90% male. An ad for cashier positions in supermarkets went to 75% female audience, and an ad for taxi company positions went to 75% Black workers, as opposed to all other groups. So, what these researchers have concluded, as well as Department of Justice through an investigation that they did of Facebook that resulted in a recent lawsuit, there's a lot of algorithmic discrimination. And the big problem, as I see it, is that employers, and I concur with Eric, I think most employers don't want to see themselves discriminating. And when my colleagues and I reached out to probably 60, 70 different companies or more about this kind of algorithmic discrimination, or the targeting of job ads based on age and gender, not a single company told us this is an integral part of our strategy and we need to be able to discriminate based on gender or age when we are targeting our ads. It was just something that was done because it was available. And so to me, I think it illustrates that oftentimes when technology companies or vendors put out products into the market without guardrails or without people thinking about it, it can result in some pretty disastrous consequences. And so I know I've talked a bunch about Facebook today, but I do want to underscore that, even though Facebook has gotten the most attention and subjected to the most legal actions, virtually every company that is involved in advertising or sourcing workers is using an algorithm, whether it's deciding who is going to get an ad, which jobs to show workers on a job board, which workers to recommend to an employer to hire. They're all susceptible to discrimination. So, we need every company that is involved, every vendor involved, to be doing what it can to analyze where there is bias, whether it's explicit or more indirect. And I'll leave on a positive note. The solution can be fairly simple sometimes. LinkedIn, for example, in 2018, it was reported changed their algorithm for their recruiter app so that the top rankings of workers who would be shown to employers would be have a similar gender breakdown as the labor market in that particular industry or type of job that the employer was searching for. And so it ensured that if there's a 60-40 breakdown, 60% women, 40% men, that you'd see the same top rankings and not see mostly men in the top rankings. That's a small change, but makes an enormous difference. And the solutions to these kinds of algorithmic problems sometimes are more simple than we think. So again, we need to look at what they're actually doing and where there could be some big problems. It's not always, you don't have to do regression analysis all the time to figure out what's going on. Sometimes there are just some very big red flags that if you get behind and into that black box, you can figure out what's going on.
Thanks so much, Peter, for your work to really bring attention to how some very common recruiting practices can impact equal opportunity in very significant ways. And Eric, I'll turn to you. I appreciate, as does Peter, that employers are trying to get it right and eliminate bias. How have the employers you've worked with been thinking about how to prevent and detect bias that can stem from the use of automated systems for hiring and recruiting? Applicant tracking systems are important tools to help employers manage their applicant flow, but sometimes systems can incorporate existing discrimination and serve as barriers to opportunity. Can you share what you've learned are some do's and don'ts so employers can use their systems in a way that promotes equal opportunity?
Thank you, Director Yang. And Peter, when your Facebook advertising case was first filed a few years ago, a couple of weeks later, I was on an ABA panel with then Commissioner Vicki Lipnick. I suggested the case was one to watch and one that everyone in the audience should work with their HR clients to ensure they were not buying advertising in a manner identified in the complaint to the extent they actually had visibility into where their ads are being shown. And thank you for proving me right, and thank you for your work in that important area. I also recognize that there are different disciplines in the audience, in our large audience today, at experience levels. So let me step back a little bit. You asked about applicant tracking systems as part of this. There are about 24 major vendor systems doing applicant tracking systems. Obviously, there are lots of other things in AI that are more than 100, but about 24 major vendor systems. Some are offered by very large publicly traded companies, others are VC-backed startups. For Fortune 500 companies, they typically use one of 4 or 5 of the largest systems. A number of large companies have created their own homegrown systems, often with some other vendor system connected to it. The way I sort of think about this hiring and sourcing in a maturity model, the first level is chaotic or reactive. The second level is inconsistent and driven by individuals. The third level is systematic. And the fourth level, where more companies are trying to go to, is more of a strategic sourcing and recruiting system. So some of these applicant tracking systems are elementary record keeping systems. Others run the gamut of sourcing, hiring, onboarding, and employee transfer life cycle. Some of them do the resume screening that was talked about a little bit earlier. Many of them do automatic notices about the interview process or about the process in general required by law, or if an employer wants to give more information beyond that. And then some of the products are really sophisticated, or at least in their marketing materials they are. They are anonymizing people in the entire hiring process to reduce unconscious bias, engaging in analytics for current skills, and as Peter mentioned, hopefully removing proxies for age, race, gender, or disability status, or other protected status. One of them says that they're using an AI neural network with 1 billion profiles that focus on skills. I'll be honest, I don't know what that means. I think ReNika, you were mentioning something along those lines. And others have services for the hiring manager, nudging a live interviewer to rate soon after that live interview, and providing relevant information up front so that the decision-making process is done soon right after that live interview. Others are using it to integrate new hires, automate tasks, and personalized welcome experiences. And others are doing, hopefully, some of them are doing more formalized, personalized career site for applicants and employees. There's a lot of folks who are worried that the traditional legacy methods for mentorship and skill development, promotion, ladder transfer have a disparate impact against women and minorities and disabled individuals. And some of the vendors are suggesting that this self-service career planning will somehow remove these barriers from legacy systems. And then for the largest organizations, they're really, to go with some of the other panels, they're really focusing on data management. I know that folks use tens or hundreds of applications. One of the 18 large companies that we're working with in our incubator actually had more than 20 million applications last year. How do you focus on that data? How do you become fair to those 20 million applicants in the system? So in terms of do's and don'ts, I greatly appreciate the Commission's recent technical assistance guidance on disability and automated technologies. I think thoughtful people will start with the existing law and selection procedures that tells you what to do as a floor, whether they're creating bias, whether or not, and while we're talking about new technologies, Title VII and uniform guidelines still apply. I think that small and medium-sized businesses, unlike some large organizations, probably do not have an IO psychologist or maybe even experience employment counsel. But at the very least, you should ask a vendor for their validation study, ask questions and understand how they're going to apply, and ask whether or not the testing that they're doing is actually related to the jobs that you're hiring for. Ideally, what some of the larger organizations are doing, even if they use a vendor, they're doing their own statistical analysis of the results for their organization. So if you're going to buy a tool, whether you're in HR or legal or finance, I think you need to understand how you're going to use it. Is it a screening tool or a tool merely to enhance the experience of the candidate and the hiring manager? How much input does the tool have on the decision? Earlier, folks talked about how people are being completely screened out by these tools. Is it one factor, or is it the factor in screening resumes and screening candidates? And what audit and notice provisions do the candidate have? And what appropriate accommodation procedures are hardwired into the tool? And what is the role of human oversight, whether it's by the vendor or by your HR department or your legal department? One thing that we really haven't talked about were privacy controls, which I think is very interesting in an evolving area of the law, an evolving area of how companies are thinking through this. If you use a particular vendor, does that vendor take your data and then aggregate it to other employers? Does that violate California law? Does that somehow violate European law or the upcoming UK issues? I think you really need to think about these issues very carefully. And the most important to me is, frankly, does this actually work? Does it provide you with the candidates that you're looking for on a non-discriminatory basis? What we're seeing in the incubator are some blocking and tackling issues, particularly with areas of governance and accountability, technical robustness and safety, some of the global issues, and notice issues are all very complicated and thoughtful issues. What notice do you provide to an applicant? How often do you provide that notice? And one size fits all may not work. Giving someone 10 days notice may not necessarily work if a organization is trying to fill a teacher job that very day or the very next day because there's an opening. I do want to close by saying I do appreciate that the Commission and the Department of Labor are supporting innovation and recognized earlier that the vast majority of employers want to do the right thing. And I hope that future guidance is written so that employers who want to comply can actually figure out how to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate that and your emphasis on how important it is for employers to understand how these systems are working, because often that can be the challenge, right? Not getting the information that you actually need to meet your responsibilities under equal opportunity law. And we're happy to engage in those conversations to really help navigate this field. We're going to move to solutions, and that is one of the most exciting places. And we're going to ask each of you to respond to the same question. I'll start with the first, and then I'll turn it to Chair Burrows. And I'll go in order of Wilneida, ReNika, Peter, and then Eric. Can you highlight how technology can be used to expand job recruiting opportunities to workers that have been historically underrepresented? How do we harness technology for good?
Wilneida? Yes, I think we heard a few really powerful examples. I think the first thing is the companies that are developing a lot of these products need to start designing them with workers in mind. And that means engaging not just technical expertise as they are designing these very complex systems and algorithms, but this also means engaging disability experts and labor experts and psychology experts, et cetera, around designing these products so that you can ensure that even the well-intentioned companies that are coming forth and designing diversity and inclusion algorithms, these are algorithms that are specifically looking to predict whether a candidate is from a diverse class, that removes names and different proxies. Like there's a lot of companies that are purposely targeting, using the power of technology to remove proxies that could be used to make implicit bias against certain workers. And so even those well-intentioned products, to ensure that algorithms and that the technology is really serving workers in an equitable way, they need to be audited and they need to be it was mentioned, Eric, one thing that employers can do is ask for those validation audits that they may have done in designing this product and see to what extent that they engaged a variety of expertise other than just technical expertise. And a lot of what I'm beginning to see, which is exciting, is really a lot of these tools are really sort of increasing the accountability and the knowledge base for employers by providing, as they're doing their own recruitment, they're providing talent analytics and diversity analytics, and that helps companies to determine and to evaluate to what extent they are hitting different diversity targets they have set for themselves.
Thank you so much. I'll turn it to ReNika. Really appreciate those concrete suggestions on how we can reach underrepresented communities.
Sure. So I think that what a lot of these technologies do allow us to do is to track. We talk about applicant tracking systems, but there's also abilities to understand what's happening in the hiring process and in the recruiting process. Like the technologies do allow us to see, who saw the advertisement. A lot of those functionalities aren't always used, but I think we could be using them to learn more about how is it working with, various protected categories of marginalized groups, and where do we need to improve, like using that data to help expand the pie, not just to streamline or narrow. So I think that's one huge opportunity that this technology offers us for like record keeping and tracking from the lawyer and me thinks about. And I think in terms of exposure and access, we can now advertise and show the jobs. Peter talked about how you can show the jobs. Like there's no reason why his client can't see the same advertisements as her daughter. And that we do have the ability to make awareness of jobs more available and more equitable. And I think we should take advantage of those and thinking about how we can do that in a consistent way. And a lot of that is talking to workers from those communities. Wilneida mentioned experts. And I think the last piece of that I would also lift up is thinking about who's designing these systems and understanding there's been a lot of work and activity around developers and developers of color, women developers. There's the Algorithmic Justice League that are talking about how we can ask more questions and document more about what the technology was designed for and whether it was being used in the way that it was designed for. And we do see employers using technologies, which we saw before technology, but using technologies in ways that they're not designed for and they haven't been validated for. So,
thank you so much, Peter.
Sure. To pick up on what ReNika was saying, which I totally agree with, is many employers may not realize this, but a lot of the systems that they're using, including for advertising and sourcing, they will provide demographics of the people who are kind of going through those systems. So for example, if you are publishing a job ad on Facebook, you get real-time data on the age distribution and the gender distribution of the people who are actually seeing those ads. And so you might get that back and say, wow, 80% of the people who are getting my ad are men, and 75% of them are under 30. What's going on there? Now, maybe most employers won't be this sophisticated, but you could, kind of change with some testing how you're targeting your ads. You could say, well, maybe I shouldn't, maybe the disparity is happening because I'm targeting people interested in this particular thing, and that particular interest or behavior that Facebook or Twitter has identified is associated more with men than with women, or more with younger people than older people. And you could change what you're targeting. You might choose to just target people interested in job hunting, which is often one category of people you could target. You might have been using a lookalike audience, which is something that some platforms offer, where they essentially take your list of your customers or your workers, and they create a bigger list of people to then send the advertisements to, who kind of literally look like those people. So if you were using a lookalike audience and you find that your ad, who's seeing your ad is skewing in a particular different way, you can get rid of that and go to a more generic targeting routine. You might just decide that you can't get discrimination out of that particular application and abandon it. There may be some applications where you don't want to use it at all because, for example, Twitter is 70% male in terms of its usership and 30% female. So, right from the start, you're talking about reaching very different groups of people. I think one of the benefits of when you have a larger employer that has a much more sophisticated system is they are getting, hopefully, data on race, on gender, and age from their applicants, and they can actually analyze and figure out where is the roadblock. Because sometimes, the Supreme Court has said in the context of Title VII, there's no bottom line defense. You can't justify discrimination earlier on in the process by making up for it later on, you have to have equality at all, standpoint and at all parts of the process. And what we've seen, what I've heard a lot from my clients is that they think, especially in the tech industry and when they're hiring their own workers, that there's a lot of kind of fake use of the Rooney Rule, where they're doing a lot to source Black and Latino workers to actually apply an interview, but they really know the white men that they want to hire from the very start, and it's really just a show. The numbers, especially in some of these big companies, suggest that they're not making progress, even though there's a very big applicant pool of diverse applicants. So I think using big data to figure out where the obstacles are is an enormous benefit that we have now. And think about it, 30, 40 years ago, we had no idea, an employer had no idea who was actually seeing or responding to an ad when, based on race or gender or age, when they put an ad out into the ether, right? Now they actually know, and you could track and say, well, it looks like there's a very non-diverse group of people who are applying through social media, but through LinkedIn or through ZipRecruiter, we're getting a lot more diverse applicants. If you can do that and figure out a way to make sure that you're focusing on places and spaces where you have more diversity and let the more diverse equal applications win out, that would be a great result.
Thanks so much, Peter. And back to Eric.
Wow, that was a tough act to follow. I think what that just shows to me is that you need to take the best advice from thought leaders from all areas, whether they represent employees, employers, or unions, or other academics. You mentioned earlier the Algorithmic Justice League. They have 4 principles which are thoughtful. Affirmative consent, meaningful transparency, continuous oversight and accountability, and actionable critique. What's wrong with that? I think, Peter, you focus more on the sourcing side, so I'm going to talk a little bit more on the assessment side. Just to make sure that we don't say the same thing. I think that rigorous self-testing of hiring assessments before and after deployment and close to continual audit for disparities once deployed is a helpful thing to look at. It might be nice that you got, from LinkedIn or others, a nice balance of the initial applications, but I think you need to look as you do tests, as you do hiring assessments, what are your actual results with that? And was it actually designed for your job or just in general a customer service representative? Was it generally just described for a retail sales worker? And frankly, how are the results interpreted is really important, and who gets to interpret those results. But I do go back to my first point, which is take the best advice from thought leaders wherever they come from.
Great, well, thank you. And you touched on some of this already, but I want to dig a little deeper and just ask each of you how employers can remove barriers to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And they may be barriers they're aware of and maybe not. And those barriers being, of course, recruiting and hiring technologies. And then relatedly, if you have advice for employers that are looking to encourage vendors or their own programmers to design systems that are going to promote equal opportunity and better document and evaluate hiring decisions. So we can take it in any order, but if not, I'll start with ReNika Moore, and then we can go through.
Sure. So, I think that we've thrown out some really great ideas about what employers can do. I think I'll reiterate that in terms of understanding sort of what's happening in the process and making sure that employers are using systems that they themselves sort of understand and they can ask or answer questions about when is AI being used in the technologies they're using? And when I say that, I mean, sometimes, it may be that, for example, if you're using Zoom for interviews, you are just using the video capability for 2 people to interview. But if there is some analysis happening, do you know that it is happening? I think too, and it's in your recruiting software or in your applicant tracking software, understanding when there might be a de-emphasizing of certain candidates, there might be an elevation of certain candidates, and sometimes in conversations with employers and HR officials, they don't always know. And so knowing the systems that you're using and that that you're using to identify, and then being able to answer questions, because I think another aspect that's very frustrating often for workers and for applicants is like having no idea what happened and why they might not have been selected for a job. And particularly when they're not having much success. And so figuring out ways to provide more communication, that might be outreach, that might be feedback when there were promising candidates. I think particularly for smaller searches, where we talked about, Peter talked about like a Rooney rule, where people think this is just like window dressing. Providing additional feedback and transparency about why a candidate may not have been selected can really help to address gaps and to think about why those gaps exist is critical for us to kind of deal with these problems where people are just getting an automated response and don't know what's happening. And so that kind of lack of transparency can be a real problem. And then the other piece, like I said, is that sometimes employers don't even know when AI is being used and why certain candidates are being pushed forward or elevated up in the process, and other candidates are being de-emphasized. So I think those are critical pieces to understand the technology that they're buying and being able to answer.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
And building up on that, I mean, as we're seeing in jurisdictions like New York City and Illinois, Maryland, there is the burden on employers to do more notification to potential candidates, as ReNika mentioned. Really asks for employers to really understand how the technology functions, and that goes into sort of the explainability. And I've seen some of the explainability, and it's still very technical. And so just building on what ReNika mentioned, that the explainability has to be described in accessible and plain language, so that workers from different backgrounds, different education or comfort levels with technology can really understand what's at stake and what's being used. And so just increasing, again, the knowledge of the technology that you're using, being proactive about communicating how it functions in plain language, and also being proactive with ensuring to candidates that reasonable accommodation is available, and just much more responsibility for employers to lead, to have the opportunity to be able to lead, to help guide workers through understanding what these technologies really do, and how they are providing accommodations to account for some of the barriers to access and to usability.
Okay, great, thank you.
Just to echo a couple of points too, to draw on something that ReNika said earlier, it matters a lot what the diversity of the people who are building these products looks like. When we think about some of the most unfortunate scandals related to tech and the technology industry, whether it's Google tagging pictures of Black people as monkeys, or Facebook creating these racial ethnic affinities, so that and not realizing that employers or housing providers might exclude Black people from getting housing ads or job ads. You have to think that if you had a more diverse group of people than you have at these companies in the room, they might say, hey, wait a second, there might be this negative way that this product could be used, or we should think about these kinds of ways in which this outcome could happen. Studies show that more diverse groups of people make better decisions, listen to each other more, and you get better outcomes. We have really poor diversity, particularly in the technical fields at some of these major tech companies. I don't think that that's a product of a lack of outstanding qualified Black and Latina applicants. You have, particularly from HBCUs, and major public universities, you have an incredible crop of young engineers graduating, and they should be hired by these companies. They should be the people who can help inform the product decisions. Unfortunately, think what we've seen in the last 15 to 20 years is too much of this kind of move fast and break things ethos in tech companies. And no disrespect, Eric, but when VC money comes in and startups come in, and you've got these companies that don't have any real track record or history or sense of why what our history is in business, and they're creating new products and rolling them out. We need them to slow down and be more careful and do validation studies so that when they're putting their product out there, that employers, whether they're big or small, can have a greater assurance that these won't do more harm than good. And I think we're really at the beginning stage of all of this, but adding more diversity to the mix would go a long way.
I don't take offense at all. I'm a nonprofit CEO now, so I do think we need to go back. And again, this was a joint between the EEOC and OFCCP, so I'm mindful of Executive Order 11246 and other affirmative action obligations of the contractor community. I think you need to go back to basics a little bit. What did your affirmative action plan, your federally required affirmative action plan, the one that you embrace as part of your S and ESG, what did it say you were going to do? You were going to go to minority job fairs. You were going to expand the pool. You were going to write your job descriptions in a way that wasn't discriminatory. How do you take the old school technology, the old school activities, and bring them up to the current algorithms? How do you make sure that those vendors are actually using a job description of what the job really is? I was mindful of the work that Chair Burrows did on, does a job require 6 years of experience or 1 year suffice? Does it require a master's degree or does it require no degree? So I do think, as we think about how to expand the pool, and employers really do want to expand the pool, at least they say so, and I believe that most employers really do want to expand the pool. I think you need to look at beyond what the current people are in the job when developing these tools. If you look at that, to your point, Peter, that 92% of a particular job is a white male from Minnesota, that is not the training data you need if you're going to try and expand the pool. You need to be much more robust in the manner in which that the algorithm debias its efforts.
Thank you. Well, that is super helpful to hear all of that together. And I will just say we will do what I like to call a lightning round. And I would love to hear, as we wrap up now, and consider the work ahead, what are 1 or 2 practical takeaways for our agencies, employers, workers, or anyone listening about how we can get this right, and how we make sure that this increasing and very exciting area in employment really does work in a way that advances equal opportunity as opposed to the opposite. So I'll start. I don't know who wants to go first. I was going to kick it back to you, to Eric Reicin, to kick us off, but
sure, I'll continue talking. That's fine. Once again, I'm delighted to be asked to attend. I certainly learned from others on this panel. That was great. I'm going to follow up with several of you on particularly some of the data information that I just didn't know about. And I'm certainly glad that the Commission and the Department of Labor is speaking with stakeholders on this frankly complex and evolving topic. When we started today's discussion, I mentioned that BBB National Programs has been operating successful accountability and dispute resolution programs for decades. And these independent industry self-regulatory programs operate in a way that's complementary to government agencies, sometimes with adjacency to government, sometimes as part of a co-regulatory framework. And we've seen firsthand that many businesses want to act responsibly, especially when it comes to use of new technologies. So as you think about how to approach artificial intelligence in hiring and recruiting, and it's what some of the incubator is looking at, is what problems are you trying to solve? And then will the machine learning solution or solutions solve that problem and do it in a way that does not expose your organization to legal liability from people like Peter? But more importantly, is it accretive to your human capital approach and your organizational anti-discrimination, S&ESG, diversity, DEIB, DEIA, whatever you want to call it this week? Are you expanding the pool of applicants? Are you being fair to applicants? Are the tools actually measuring the skills in the particular job? And once again, I'm going to say that these are complicated and evolving technologies. So a one-size approach to regulation and a one-size approach to a particular product may or may not work for you. And thank you again for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you for joining us. I'll go down to Peter Romer-Freidman, since he came up in that last, if you want to jump in here for your last couple of takeaways.
Thanks. Two quick things. One is, I think it'd be really helpful for the Commission to issue some guidance and maybe even regulations on how these kind of digital intermediaries are covered. I know you've touched on that a little bit in the terrific guidance you offered on the ADA earlier, I think this year or last year. But in particular, these kinds of, any companies that are involved in advertising, sourcing jobs, matching employers and employees in some way, in my view, those are independent, those are what would be considered employment agencies under Title VII or the ADA or the ADA, or they can be considered in some instances agents of employers. So I think spelling out more clearly that those kinds of entities have liability and actually have a duty to follow Title VII and other civil rights laws is really important. I think we've seen companies like Facebook and others take the position in federal court that they are not obligated to follow or comply with Title VII at all. And I think when companies believe that they have immunity or that they don't have any legal obligations, I think they're less likely to think about following the law and take those obligations seriously. Certainly, if the EEOC found and believed that certain newspapers that segregated women and men based on the types of jobs in classifieds, 50 years ago, if those can make a newspaper, an employment agency, the kinds of interactive companies online could easily be considered employment agencies. And then I also think it would be very useful to offer some guidance on advertising and sourcing and recruiting in terms of methods that result in certain groups being targeted or other groups being excluded. There's not a ton of bones in the regs, and we've seen both before the EEOC and in federal court, defendants argue that targeted advertising and discrimination in recruiting is not prohibited by our federal civil rights laws, in part pointing to the fact that there are not EEOC regs addressing the kind of distributional questions. So I think touching on that in an updating rulemaking or guidance would be really helpful and would create some deterrence. Thank you.
Okay,
and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I learned a ton from other folks here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Wilneida, Negrón.
Yeah, I think, just kind of piggybacking what was said, do employers need to be smart shoppers, do their due diligence, sort of what Peter mentioned. A lot of these products were developed, they're proprietary. We don't know who was engaged in the development of these products when they went to market. And so just now we're understanding the risk and the harms and gathering the evidence of that. And so employers need to know that they have the right to ask questions. They have a right, and there's a set of guidelines and principles that they can inquire. And so ask questions, really get to know the principles and the values and the testing that those vendors undertook and who they engaged. And so asking a lot of questions and also engaging workers around, what is the role of AI, sophisticated technologies in the workplace, because it's not only the hiring tools, it's also a suite of other tools, highly complex technology, whether it's workplace productivity monitoring, et cetera. And so have that conversation with your workers and, bring them into the conversation of what do they think, that the role, how to build these tools and use them in a way that's equitable and not detrimental to their well-being.
Terrific. Okay. ReNika Moore, you get the last word.
So much pressure. Yeah. So, so great things have been said along the way in terms of, so I want to echo, regulations. I think those pieces, guidance from that, I think it's really important to hold employers accountable for the technologies that they use. We obviously want to see more transparency from vendors as well, but employers really do need to kick the tires and understand before they buy these technologies and roll them out in terms of their uses. And I think, the regulators can really set the tone for making sure that employers understand that. In terms of, something we haven't talked about as much as clearly, Wilneida highlighted this in her opening comments, but I think the tech and the AI that's being used for low-wage workers who are disproportionately Black, Latinx, in thinking about the tech that's being used that they interface with is different than the more specialized labor sectors And so there are different strategic values in thinking about what workers know about what's happening in terms of their application process. I have a teenage son who was applying for jobs, and he was like, they asked me these strange questions, and he just didn't understand why. And I think that's particularly true in the retail sector, where they're screening for other types of, trying to avoid unionizing activity and other hostile things. And so thinking about those different approaches in terms of how we're looking at the AI that's used in the sectors where a lot of people of color are interacting with, and there's high turnover, I think is really critical and important as well. So I really thank you for making this conversation happening, and I learned so much from the other panelists.
Well, thank you. And I am incredibly grateful to each of you. On behalf of Director Yang and myself, I'd like to thank every one of you who joined us today. Special thanks, of course, to our colleagues at EEOC and OFCCP who helped prepare today's event. And most of all, I really have deep thanks for our distinguished guests for their time, valuable insights, and we will be following up on all of these ideas. Discussions like this one are so critical to help employers and our agencies, frankly, reimagine how we go about this business of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. I think it will be very helpful for employers as they are thinking about how to reimagine hiring and tapping into those diverse pools of talent that have historically been left on the sidelines. AI can be such a powerful tool to assist in this process, but as we have heard from our panelists, it can also automate discrimination against protected groups. And I really appreciated hearing the recommendations today on how to use AI and other automatic technology systems in a way that doesn't lead to discrimination practices. Either in recruitment or in hiring, and so that we can really look forward to have those used in a way that's consistent with efforts to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So I so look forward to the work ahead and to what we can accomplish together. And I thank all of you for joining us.